Hello everyone, Eternal Flame here, and welcome back to Eternal Flame Making a Theory. Let's go! I was originally going to upload a vid about like 5 Jujutsu Kaisen fights I wish we could have seen. However, with this new chapter, there was something really interesting introduced that I talked about in my spoiler review, well not spoiler review, that I feel the need to talk about right now. And that is the fact that the 10 shadows can bypass Limitless, or what more so, specifically, the shadows of a 10 shadow user can bypass the Limitless barrier. However, before I get into my theory of explaining why this is possible, it would really help if you left a like on the video, especially if you like anime content like this. It's the best way to let me know you like my theories, and be sure to subscribe. We have plenty more on the way, and you can unsubscribe whenever you want. Anyway, let's get straight into the theory of why this is even possible. So up first, I do need to establish this simple fact. We do literally see Gojo ending up sinking in the shadows right before Maharaga tries to grab him. No, that is not Maharaga's hand attempting to grab him. We know for a fact that is just Gojo sinking into the shadows and then Maharaga grabbing him, purely because we see Maharaga's hands the literal next panel. So yes, the 10 shadows are able to bypass the Limitless. This is not for debate. At least the shadow that the user of the 10 shadows have access to. We don't know if the Shikigami themselves have access to it or just Maharaga themselves. But there are just two ways to interpret this, and either way is honestly extremely interesting, and that is why I'm making this theory today. The first interpretation, and what might be the more likely one, I'm not entirely sure, I'm doing this entirely, leave it up to you, is that Maharaga's adaptation also applies to the shadows themselves, which means when Maharaga's wheel is finished turning, the shadows were also able to bypass the Limitless now. And then there is the second interpretation, which is that due to the shadows not having a physical mass and having physical matter, they are able to bypass Limitless's barrier because they cannot detect things that technically don't physically exist at all, because shadows do not have physical matter to them. They are just shadows. Okay, so I do need to establish this as well. While both of these interpretations lead to mutually different outcomes, they both are not mutually exclusive. Both can also be possible. However, I only see these two being the possible ones for now. We will have to wait until the next chapter comes out, but I'm now going to go over what this actually could potentially mean. I'm going to start out with the first interpretation of the shadows also get Maharaga's adaptation. And this could be extremely busted in my opinion, depending on just how far this actually can go. Because this means the 10 shadows themselves, or at least the shadow that the 10 shadows rise out from, are able to get the adaptation that Maharaga can get. Which can also mean all of the Shikigami that come from 10 shadows can potentially get Maharaga's adaptation, which would allow all of the 10 shadows to come out and be possible to attack Gojo now that Maharaga has potentially adapted. They would all be able to bypass Limitless, not just Maharaga. Or at least attacks being used with his shadow would be able to bypass the Limitless. We at least know for a fact the shadow can bypass Limitless because we know Gojo can sink into the shadows. So this means the shadows are now a viable option for attacking Gojo, and potentially attacks that rise up from the shadows might potentially work now on Gojo because they are now adapted. The reason why I believe the Shikigami also get Maharaga's adaptation is purely because of Maharaga's name being the Divine General, and what is a general's role more often than not in the military, and just in general, to lead. So if all the Shikigami were able to get Maharaga's adaptation, then he would be able to lead the other Shikigami in battle against Gojo or just someone like that with the adaptation now applied to them, if the adaptation is why the shadows are able to bypass the Limitless barrier. Of course, this is assuming that Maharaga's adaptation also applies to the other Shikigami and not just the shadows and Maharaga itself, because we do know at least for sure, if this theory proves to be true, that the shadows themselves get Maharaga's adaptation. But there is the potential that the Shikigami could also get it, which is why I think it needs to be brought up. Now, I know I said earlier that I think the first interpretation is more likely, but I lied. I do think the second interpretation is actually more likely for why the shadows are able to bypass Limitless, and that is due to the fact that they do not have a physical mass. And there are a few reasons why I genuinely do think that they are likely to be able to bypass Infinity. Now, one of the reasons that I do believe that Gojo's Limitless barrier is not able to detect the shadows even without the adaptation is purely because of something Gojo was talking about that he struggled with back when he was a kid, when he was talking to Shoko and Geto about things he was trying to figure out with his barrier, which was making it detect poisonous gases. The reason why I think this is so important is because if he was already struggling with figuring out ways to add poisons to his Limitless barriers, then there is no way he would likely be able to figure out how to make it so his Infinity barriers can pick up things that do not have matter or mass, because he would have nothing to practice it on because, well, Megumi didn't figure out how to use his 10 shadows like this for a long while, and even then he only figured out how to store weapons inside of his shadows. It was only Sukuna who was able to do this. or at least who showed the capability to do it to Gojo, because yeah, Megumi does this against Reggie. On top of that, the barrier works on detecting things on their threat level, whether they are or are not threats, and considering the fact that the 10 Shadows doesn't have mass or matter at all, it just basically wouldn't exist to Gojo's point of view with the 6 eyes, so it wouldn't be able to be added to the barrier. However, there is one more reason that I'm extremely confident that it actually is because of the Shadows being a shadow for why they bypass the Limitless barrier, and not because of the fact that they have gotten Maharaga's adaptation. And that is because of something that was established really early on, which is the fact that the 10 Shadows and the Limitless 6 eyes users are always rivals to each other. Especially considering the fact that we know in the past a 6 eyes user and a 10 Shadows user were able to kill each other. Now yes, we do know Megumi theorized that it was because of Maharaga killing them both. However, I don't think that was the case, because a huge part of Gojo and why Gojo teaches Megumi the way he does is to not fully rely on the Shikigami, but to rely on himself as well, and the power of interpreting his technique the way it's supposed to be interpreted. Interpreting the technique to make it his own, to make it reach its pinnacle levels of power. It's also why Megumi's domain expansion is genuinely as busted as it is, because of the power of interpretation that gets put into it, Megumi being able to interpret his shadows in several ways, being able to create several Shikigami and clones of himself, etc. But that's me getting off track. But it's through that power of interpretation that I believe a 10 Shadows user was able to defeat a 6 eyes Limitless user in the past. Well, the power of interpretation, as well as taking advantage of the fact that the Shadows don't have a physical form, which allows them to bypass the Limitless barrier. I think they were able to get a mutual kill, full-on Orochimaru style, Orochimaru versus Hiruzen style, by using their shadows to bypass the Limitless barrier and land a final hit on the Gojo clan member, so they both could die in the process. It would also make a lot of sense, because how else is a 10 Shadows user supposed to be able to hit a Limitless user, especially considering the fact we know for a fact that Maharaga was never tamed once before until this very point, and while yes, this theory from Megumi suggests Maharaga was responsible for both deaths, we don't actually have full-on confirmation of that yet, and I'm not entirely sure if that theory is true or not. However, if that theory is true, that just proves my first interpretation to likely be true as well, that it's just the 10 Shadows gains access to Maharaga's adaptation, and that is why the Shadows itself are able to adapt and move past the Limitless barrier that Gojo has set up. So it's either the fact the Shadows are extremely based on the power of interpretation, and on top of that, it can't technically be detected due to the fact they don't actually have physical matter or exist, and that is how they're able to bypass the Limitless barrier. Or because Maharaga's adaptation has been adapted towards the Shadows, and that is how they're able to get through the Limitless barrier in order to hit Gojo. Either way, what we can take for certain from this chapter is that the Shadows are able to bypass the Limitless barrier completely due to the fact that Gojo was starting to sink into a shadow barrier without Maharaga even needing to try and grab Gojo. Which means no matter what, the Shadows are able to bypass the barrier, and this could be the way that the Shikigami are reintroduced into the fight, with the ability now that they can bypass the Limitless barrier entirely and actually land hits on Gojo. Either way, this is going to be really sick. But now I'm curious, what do you guys think about this entire video? What do you guys think about this theory about why the Shadows are able to bypass the Limitless barrier? Do you guys think it's because the Shadows get Maharaga's adaptation ability, or do you think it is because of the fact that Shadows don't have a physical matter that they're able to bypass the barrier? I'm curious to see your comments down below. I'm gonna see y'all later. Peace.